I'm so tired of seeing Portra 400 being reduced to that peace yellow look that wedding photographers seem to love, that today I'm gonna make an entire video showing you how you can emulate Portra 400 on your digital files and the actual method behind of it, so you can get rich, dense colors and still retain that warm feeling that Portra is known for. And I'm gonna start with this photo, which I purposely shot underexposed because I was trying to protect the highlights up here, especially in the clouds, and trying not to blow them out. But because I wasn't paying enough attention to my histogram, I probably overcompensated for the brighter areas in the photos, so I'm gonna push my exposure up with around 1 stop for now, and I'm going to switch from Adobe Color as my camera profile to a linear profile that I created, and on top of that I'm going to press Shift Q on my keyboard, and in here I'm going to apply a luminance range mask across the entire photo, in which I'm going to very quickly build an S-curve that has a strong filmic shoulder and a similarly strong filmic toe over here, but I'm also going to shift the pivot point towards the shadows, and this is going to give me a pretty filmic look to begin with, so I can build my entire edit based on this custom gamma curve. So what I've done here was basically creating a really custom camera profile that sits on top of my entire edit, which I haven't even started yet. It's just putting in place some guardrails for my tones to be sure that I'm going to get that nice filmic toe and filmic shoulder, and with a bit of a raised black point, because that's how I want my Portra emulation to look like. And now I'm actually gonna start doing my basic edits. I'm gonna start with my color temperature, and because I want my portrait to look a bit warm, I'm trying to make my shadows lean just a tiny bit into the blues while I have my vibrance and saturation maxed out, but I'm not going to go crazy with the white balance, pushing it towards something like this, where everything in the photo is going to start to look yellow. I still want to get a pretty accurate white balance base to begin with, and we can tweak our colors going from there. So I'm going to settle on something like maybe 7000 or around there, and I'm also going to push a bit more magenta into my photo because we do have a lot of green in it, but I don't want that to be overpowering. Now let's reset vibrance and saturation, and let's take care of our shadows, which are pretty strong, especially in this part of the image. So I'm going to push my shadows up with around 20 points, and also my blacks as well, but not that much. And generally when I'm emulating film, I'm being rather careful with my highlights and shadow slider. If I push them too far, I'm gonna get an HDR look that doesn't really fit in with the film aesthetics. We want to have nice smooth gradients going from dark to bright areas of our photos, so we don't want to have a ton of details in our shadows where they would be so distracting and also really inaccurate for film emulation. And I'm going to do a similar thing with my highlights, which I'm going to pull down a bit more to get more details in my skies, but also I'm going to push my whites up a bit more to get a brighter overall image, because it was still a bit underexposed. Now let's focus on color since I'm done with the basic adjustment, and for that I'm going to go to my color response curves and I'm going to select the Portra 400 in the push configuration, because this is exactly what we want to emulate. And while the photo got a bit too green and a bit too cold, I can tweak that very quickly with a white balance slider and a bit more tint towards magenta. And if you don't know what color response curves are, let me go through that very briefly. It's my way of emulating the colors of film using just the red, green and blue color curves. This way I can still edit my photos without the preset being in the way, while still getting really nice filmy colors. And of course, if you wanna grab some of my color response curves, you can do so on my website. And now it's time to start masking. And with my masking, I'm gonna try and do a few things. First of all, I'm trying to reshape the light. I want this foreground part over here to be much darker because it holds a ton of information right now, which I don't really care about. So I'm gonna start with a large radial gradient, which I'm going to invert so it only covers the bottom part of the photo. And from it, I'm also going to subtract a linear gradient to tone it down. And in here, I'm going to use the curve tool to tone down my shadows and get something like this, which is a much darker foreground with a lot less contrast, so it doesn't look that distracting. And I did that using the curve tool because whenever you're pulling down on a curve, creating some of that flat filmic toe, you're also reducing the saturation in the area. And in here we can see that with our mask, if we pull on the refine saturation slider, where we would get something like this, where we had a ton of green in the foreground, and I don't want that. So I'm taking advantage of the way the curves work, and I'm gonna let that live at 100% with my very strong filmic toe over here to lower the amount of contrast, decrease the exposure, and reduce the saturation in the foreground. And now I want to turn my attention towards color, because film has this thing called filmic roll-off, or filmic saturation roll-off, where it's starting to lose saturation in the brighter areas of the photo, where our digital photos usually have this thing where our midtones and especially brighter areas get more saturated because the sensor got more light. So I want to rectify that, and I'm going to start with the linear gradient, which is gonna be pretty big and covering the upper part of my photo, and from it I'm going to subtract my subject because I don't want to affect her and desaturate her skin. And in this mask I'm going to pull down the saturation slider pretty heavy to around -40 points, and I'm doing that to level up the saturation level across the entire photo, and I'm going to apply my own saturation to the image. But before I can do that, I'm also going to go back to my gamma curve, which I applied at the beginning of the edit. I'm going to tone down the refine saturation slider as well to get more latitude and a flatter image to begin with. And in that linear gradient, it would have been really tempted to add more light and lose color like that. But that way I would have also lost dynamic range that I really want to keep, because Portra 400 is known for having a great dynamic range and detail retention. So instead, what I'm going to do is create my own custom saturation mask. And I'm going to do that once again with a luminance range mask, in which I'm going to slightly pull back the shadows and pull back the highlights pretty hard until I'm left with something like this, where I'm mostly targeting my midtones. And in this mask, I'm going to push my saturation around 50% or even a bit more in some cases. And you can see right now that the saturation across the entire photo is much more consistent, and my highlights and midtones are not oversaturated compared to my shadows. But even after addressing the saturation issue, I still feel that the upper part of the photo is a bit distracting. And to address that, I'm gonna first enable the profile correction for my lens to get rid of the strong vignette that I had in the upper part of the image. And that also brought up the lower part, so let's tweak the mask a bit to address this. And I'm going to decrease the saturation and lower the curve even more to get back my faded and darken foreground over here, while also going to decrease the exposure just a tiny bit, because that introduced a ton of light back into the image. And secondly, I'm gonna go back to mask number 3, which was addressing the upper part of the photo, and in here I want to reduce the contrast, which I'm gonna do using the curve tool. And I'm going to drop a point in the darker area of the forest and one in the brighter area of the forest. And I'm going to push my highlights down a bit while increasing my shadows to reduce overall contrast. And this is going to simulate the lack of contrast that you get whenever you are shooting in an environment with a bit more pollutants in the air. And that's a trick that I use quite a lot lately, and sometimes I even mix in some clarity reducing to simulate that there are more particles in the air and the camera was not able to see that clearly what's going on in the background. But keep in mind, whenever you do that, make sure that you always lower the saturation as well in that part of the image, because if you have a ton of particles, you don't get that many colors in that area. So I'm over here with around -40 saturation in that upper part of the image. And with that out of the way, there's one more thing that I want to do regarding the reshaping of light. I'm gonna create one more mask, which is gonna be pretty large, a radial gradient over here, and I want to brighten up the shadows on her just a tiny bit. So I'm going to create this radial gradient, and in here I'm raising up my shadows, and I'm also going to pull the midtones up just a tiny bit, but I'm paying attention that I'm not blowing out my highlights more than it needed to be, because this area is already pretty hot. So let's maybe pull the highlights down a bit more to control that bright area, and we can see that this mask is actually reshaping the center of the photo, helping us draw attention on our subject a bit more. And with all this done, I think it's finally time to address the warm feeling that people actually expect when we're talking about Portra, although Portra 400 is not always that warm. And to do that, I'm gonna start by pushing the green primary in the calibration panel towards the right with probably 10 or 15%, and also the blue primary to the left, but this one I'm gonna be even more conservative with, and I wanna play around with the HSL for warmth. And what I'm going to do is slightly skew to the left, mostly the entire hue panel, something like this. I'm not gonna bother with the purple and magenta too much, but I'm generally trying to create a nice curve over here, slightly towards the left. And that's another really good tip. Whenever you're playing with the HSL panel, try not to push one single slider too far compared to the ones next to them, because in that case you're gonna create breakage in your photo and you're gonna get some really nasty lines that are gonna look very distracting. I also want to play around with the color grading wheels a bit, but before I can do that, I need to check my vector slope, and for that I'm gonna make sure that it's covering my skin tones, and as you can see right now, the line over here indicates that I have my skin tones a bit rotated on the hue compared to the skin tone line. So what I'm going to do is create one more mask, and again a luminance range, and in here I'm going to use the hue slider and set it to something like +5 or a bit more, and that helps me rotate the hues in the entire photo to make sure that my skin tones are actually aligned with the skin tone line. And I'm also going in here and I'm going to rename the mask as hue rotation, just so I know what it's doing afterwards. And now let's actually play with the color grading wheels. I'm going to push just a tiny bit of cyan into my shadows, a bit of orange into my midtones, and in here I'm just gonna brighten up my highlights and maybe add a bit of yellow in them as well. I'm basically trying to warm up the brighter parts of the photo without affecting the shadows too much. That's a thing that is usually happening on film, and I'm also creating chromatic contrast by putting blue in my shadows and warmth in my highlights. And since this is a film emulation, it wouldn't be complete without some grain, so I'm gonna use my all-in-one grain preset, probably with 400 setting, and this is going to create a set of masks adding various amounts of grain based on the luminosity values in the photo. And if you want these grain presets, don't forget to check out my website. But on top of this, I wanna do a few more tweaks. I'm going to copy this mask, and I'm gonna do that by going to copy and select the first mask that I created. I'm going to delete it and now paste it on top of the entire image, selecting merge over there. And what's that gonna do is gonna apply the custom gamma that I created at the beginning of the edit and apply that on top of my entire image. And you saw it right there, the change was pretty significant, and now I have way more contrast in the photo because this custom gamma curve is applied on top of everything that I've done in the masking panel as well. And if, let's say, you like to emulate Portra 400 all the time, I would go in and create a custom gamma curve that is similar to the Portra look and have some of the characteristics of Portra 400 and save that as a preset so I could apply it later on all of the photos that are supposed to emulate Portra 400, of course on top of a linear camera profile. But going back to my photo, I still don't feel that it's warm enough, so I just pushed the white balance up to 8000, which is a bit more than it was before, and also I would add a bit more magenta into my shadows because it still looks pretty green overall, and I think this is close to the final step where I would land with this photo. Of course, if you feel that there's too much contrast on the bottom part right here, you could probably just lift the effect of this mask or tone it down a bit more to get more of that faded look that we are used from Portra 400, but generally this is what I would consider a good film emulation. And throughout this entire edit, I focused on three things. First of all, is the dynamic range, because I wanted my photo to have that great latitude that Portra has, but without looking like HDR. So I put in place that custom gamma curve in the beginning and did all my basic adjustments under it. Next up, I wanted my colors to feel rich and color dense without feeling oversaturated, and that's why I tried to decouple the saturation from the curves, and I created that custom mask where I was adding saturation mostly in the shadows and the midtones, creating that nice saturation roll-off in my highlights. And finally, I wanted to avoid that super yellowish look where you just desaturate some color channels. And I did that by having all the colors in the photo with a proper white balance and then coming in with a nice color grade that just pushed the image into looking a bit warmer than it originally did because I shot it in the shadows. And you know that if the subject is in the shadow, the entire photo is gonna look a bit colder. So I had to compensate for that, but I paid a ton of attention not to make the photo look yellowish, but instead I just wanted it to feel warm. And that's about it for my Portra film emulation. I really hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new. And if you did, make sure to hit the like and the subscribe button on your way out. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.